Salutations, fellow readers. On today's literary itinerary, we're going to be talking about The Dark is Rising, a fantasy series by Susan Cooper that's older than I am. The first book came out in 1965, and the last book came out in 1977. Overall, it was fun to read, and it doesn't feature any romance for the main characters whatsoever, thankfully. What's interesting about the structure of this series is that aside from the last book, the finale, each of the books can be read as a standalone without any knowledge of the other books. I'm going to structure this review by going through each book one at a time, giving you what I feel are the pros and cons of each book and a separate rating for each book. My summaries are going to be super brief because I don't want to be giving any spoilers. Hopefully, this will help inform you if you would like to read a specific book in the series or the series as a whole. The first book, Oversea Under Stone, is about these three siblings, two brothers and a sister, that unsurprisingly are near the sea. And I would say that the setting is a strength of this book. A con would be that the plot is pretty slow paced, which isn't that engaging for young readers, and it relies on the child reader already having pre-existing knowledge of Arthurian lore to understand what the story is about. In Susan Cooper's defense, perhaps in 1960s Britain, when this was published, that would have been common knowledge amongst children. If you go to a child in the US today and you mention Santa Claus, they're already going to think about elves and flying reindeer at the North Pole just because that's a cultural norm. So perhaps that would have been knowledge that kids would have had going into the book at the time and place this was published. I don't know because I obviously was not there. Another con is that multiple times the children like to play a game where the villains are savage natives. And they never play this game in front of any adults who might give them pushback. I'm sure kids in 1960s Britain were playing that because I have heard in the US it was common to play cowboys and Indians, and you could guess who were the good guys and bad guys in that game. The problem is to have that represented when there are no characters of color in this book and there's no pushback on that kind of rhetoric. Later in the series, there's an acknowledgement about how colonization hurt indigenous people and how it's unfair to be prejudiced against immigrants. But if you are only reading this book, you're not going to see that. I didn't really like this book because I thought that the characterization and story was boring and that the unchallenged racism was super awkward. So I would give this book 2 out of 5 stars. It was my least favorite in the series, but fortunately, it's completely skippable. And you can just go right on to book two. The Dark is Rising is the name of the second book, which I hope is not confusing given that that's the name of the overall series. The second book is definitely the most popular. It won a Newbery Honor Award and it got a screen adaptation. I've never seen the film, so I can't comment on whether or not it's good. I can only discuss the pros and cons of this book, and I have lots of good things to say. The plot does a good job in using the chosen one trope. The first book, I thought that the pacing was slow and dull, but this one, it was just a nice steady pace. The writing style of this book was beautiful. It does a really good job in using things about the setting, like the snowy weather, to build tension. It also uses the repeated motif of the phrase, the dark is rising, skillfully in order to build tension, similar to winter is coming from Game of Thrones. The vocabulary in this was fabulous. I even learned a new word, lugubrious, which means mournful. I hope I won't have cause to use that in conversation too much, other than saying to someone, "How are you today? I hope you're not feeling lugubrious." The themes in this book of personal choice being significant and nature being dangerous but not inherently evil were well expressed. Let's talk about the very few cons I had with this book. This book is pretty short And the cast is super large. So, as you can imagine, a lot of the characters do not have the page time to get good development. He comes from a really large family with lots of siblings, and all of them basically have one trait, whether this is a personality trait or a hobby. While I would say that the pacing and tension building in this book is excellent, when we get to the climax, it's actually dissatisfying because it's over so quickly. I know this is because the really big battle is going to be later in the series, but if you're reading this book by itself, it could be dissatisfying. The main character instinctively knows who is good and who is evil. That takes some suspense away from the reader because we're not wondering, ooh, who can be trusted? And yes, there is an explanation for this about the way that he's the chosen one and everything, but it's a little bit boring. I thought this was an excellent book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I would recommend reading the physical book or listening to the audiobook, which I listened to and thought the performance was very good. In the wintertime, because it is set in a snowy setting near Christmas, so I think it would be very suitable for mood readers who like to have some seasonal books. Greenwitch is the third book in the Dark is Rising sequence. It is when the children from book one meet Will, the overall series protagonist from book two. It is told primarily from the perspective of the only significant girl character in the series. You, as the reader, already know what's going on with Will being the chosen one and why to other children he seems strange, being overly mature and wise and philosophical. So to see Will through the eyes of a relatively normal child is an intriguing perspective to have. I say relatively because obviously all of the children in this series are special in some way. The plot of Greenwitch is that there is a witch that has a scary reputation, but according to the dreams that the girl is having, might not be all she seems. I can't say much because of how short this installment in the series is. The biggest pro of the book for me was the theme that art is equivalent to magic. I thought that was very beautiful. The biggest con was that it was a little bit dull, but nothing too egregious. I did still like the book. For anyone who was worried, we do have an acknowledgement here about how it's not good to come in and force Indigenous people to change, and you should respect them. And those kids have stopped playing that bad game. Whew. Overall, I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars or a 7 out of 10. The Gray King is the fourth book in the series. I wrote myself notes for all the books in the series, and for my review of this particular installment, I will be guilty of looking down at my note card more often because out of all the books in the series, this one gave me the strongest emotional response, and I need the notes to keep myself on track. So, apologies for looking away from your beautiful virtual eyes. The Gray King has Will lose his memory due to a magical illness, although his family doesn't realize it's magical. And so they inexplicably send him to stay with some obscure relatives in Wales in order to help him recover. So, because he's in a new place, the only character familiar to you, the reader, is Will. Otherwise, entirely new cast of characters. See what I mean? That this book can be read as a standalone. This book won a Newbery Medal, and I can understand why, because I have lots of positive things to say about it. The main character, aside from Will, is albino, and that's nice for disability representation. The world building in this is very good for the Welsh countryside, but also for the magical world. It has really creative use of Arthurian lore, and the prose does a good job of showing grief and bitter rage as emotions. I was pretty impressed with the theme that the light, the side you're supposed to be rooting for, is concerned with the long-term good of the majority, not the short-term, fleeting good or happiness of the individual. Very few cons of this book. We continue to have shallow character development instead of people with lots of depth and nuance and numerous personality traits. I also think that there could be a content warning for some readers here for animal death. Discussion of content warnings wasn't in existence back when this was published, so I'm not at all criticizing the author for not including it. I'm just letting you know. I really enjoyed this book and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And you could go for the physical or the audiobook. I thought it was interesting that they specifically got a different narrator for this book. They wanted somebody Welsh because this takes place in Wales. Silver on the Tree is the climactic finale in the Dark is Rising sequence that we've been building towards. The only book in the series that doesn't make sense on its own. We'll talk about some of the pros of this book. The writing style continues to be very beautiful. The themes continue to be very strong. In this installment, there's an emphasis on how the dark, right, the bad side, doesn't destroy anyone or anything in and of itself. It just puts people on the path to destroy themselves, which is in alignment with themes from previous books, like the emphasis on personal choice and free will. In fact, I think it was probably a pretty deliberate choice on the author's parts to name the main character Will. The ending that we've been building towards, it does come to a conclusion that's pretty satisfactory. The cons of this book would be that, again, it's relying on children having so much prior knowledge. It's got the Grail and Excalibur from Arthurian lore. It's got Herne and the Great Hunt from Celtic mythology. And it doesn't explain what those things are because it assumes the reader already knows. So I really have to criticize it for that because I can't imagine that even back then, that's just common knowledge of the average child that might be reading this. Another critique is that while the ending is good, it has a pretty long, dull build-up to get to that point. It doesn't have pacing that's as good as some of the previous installments. I felt pretty neutral towards this book, and I would give it 3 out of 5 stars. Overall, it was fun to read. The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. The writing style is very beautiful in terms of its description and advanced in terms of its vocabulary usage. If you've been paying attention, you will have noticed that the only book I disliked and would recommend avoiding is the first book, Oversea Under Stone. And the books that I enjoyed the most and would thoroughly recommend would be The Dark is Rising and The Gray King. Thank you so much for watching. Comment the black heart emoji for the dark so I know that you watched the entire video. Like if you want me to make more series reviews like this one, and comment below what your thoughts on this series are, whether or not you've read it or intend to read it. Please consider subscribing because that's the best way to support me. Happy reading!